And I'm delighted to say that we're joined by Paul Quinn on the line. Now, Paul is better known to Evertonians as The Esk, lifelong Evertonian who writes extensively on all things Everton and who can be heard on the Talking the Blues podcast as well. It's been a while, Paul, since we last spoke, but it's good to talk to you today.
It has, Paul, and it is good to speak to you, and I must apologise for having to bail out last time at short notice just through health reasons, but thankfully I'm fit and well, probably in a slightly better condition than Everton Football Club, but I'm hoping that they're going to recover as much as I have.
Well, let's hope so, because, of course, the deadline for 777 to complete their takeover of Everton Football Club has passed, because the share purchase agreement deadline expired at 5 o'clock this morning UK time. And no resolution, of course, Paul. So I think the obvious question at this stage is, in your view, where does that now leave Everton Football Club?
Well, it leaves Everton Football Club very much back in the hands of Farhad Moshiri, which I think for most people it will be quite concerning. Not quite as concerning as it would have been had 777 gained control, but as I'd said and as many people said, and as became very obvious as time went on, they were never going to be in a position to do so. So, you know, it was just a question of waiting until that particular share purchase agreement ran its time, which, as you say, it did at 5 o'clock this morning UK time. Where does Moshiri go from here? The club's in a slightly better position than perhaps we might have thought a few weeks ago, in the sense that it doesn't immediately need new cash. It will do sometime in June, but not in the next few days. There's quite a few large bills that need to be paid, some transfer debts from last season that are due for payment this month. Of course, Lang O'Rourke regular payments, and of course the monthly wage bill that's not necessarily covered by Everton's regular revenue. So there will be cash that's needed later this month. Of course, the transfer window opens, and it's not news that any Evertonians want to hear. But of course, that does give the opportunity, and it will be exploited regardless of what the club are currently saying, in the sense that we're going to have to sell some players for two reasons. One, the PSR situation, the profitability and sustainability rule situation. We still need to sell before the end of the financial year, at the end of this month, in order not to be in a position that we were in for the previous 2 years. But frankly, we also need the cash as well. So in the short term, the problem will be resolved by selling assets, which means selling players. But of course, Moshiri's got to look at what goes on beyond this short period, and he's got to re-engage now with some of the investors who are interested in Everton Football Club, see lots of problems with getting a deal over the line, but nevertheless see potential for the future. It's now down to Moshiri to really act like an adult and start negotiating and dealing with these people in a proper manner.
And you make a good point in relation to the day-to-day finances of the club, because Everton say that they will assess all options for future ownership following the failure of this deal, and they say that the club will continue to operate as usual. But it is true, isn't it, that 777 have been funding the club for some time. They have been covering the running costs and so forth. So I did wonder, Paul, how that failure of 777 to buy the club, how that will affect the club on a day-to-day basis moving forward. But you seem to say to me that initially, in the short term, it's not going to be an issue.
In the short term, it's not going to be an issue. It is an issue in terms of how attractive or not Everton Football Club are to a potential purchaser, because we've now got approximately £200 million more debt than we did have when the 777 deal was first announced last September. And the big issue for incoming investors is not what they're going to pay Farhad Moshiri, because frankly, Farhad Moshiri is going to be very lucky if he walks away with anything from the sale of the football club. It's what does the new investor or investors do with all of the debt, most of which is attracting extraordinary rates of interest. I would think Everton's average debt repayment costs at the moment are probably running around about 10% a month. And if you think our overall external debt position is probably around £580 million at this moment in time. That means that we're having interest costs of at least £1 million a week. And that might be sustainable in the short term, as I just described. But it's obviously not sustainable in the long term. That represents 30% of our annual income, and no business can operate on that basis, especially when it has large costs elsewhere and is still paying to complete the stadium.
And I think I'm right in saying, and I think you cover the point there as well, that any new buyers that come into the club, they will have to have discussions with, and dare I say, agreement from existing creditors such as 777 before any new buyer potentially could proceed with the purchase of the club.
Yes, absolutely. And to a degree, this is what I've been calling for quite some time, that each of the creditors individually, and up to this point, including 777, believe that they would be negotiating from a position of strength, i.e. whatever debt they held. And there's three main debt holders. There's Rights and Media Funding that got a charge on, like a mortgage, on all of Everton's assets apart from the stadium. NSP, who've got a mortgage or a charge on the stadium itself. And of course, 777, who believed that their debt was going to be converted into equity when they acquired the club. That's obviously not going to happen now. But each of those three main bodies have felt that they sit in a position of strength that I don't think they do going forwards, and I don't think they do going forwards because of the additional debt that 777 now bring to the table. And I think we have to get to a position where each of those creditors sit down in a room with the potential buyer or representative of the potential buyer and discuss how the debt is going to be repaid. It doesn't necessarily mean that all of the debt has to be repaid on day one, but it means there has to be something that's put in place that says this is a schedule of repayment, and as a result of that schedule of repayment and as a result of the quality of the new buyer, the interest costs are reduced significantly, which gives the club a little bit more breathing room, and also allows the club perhaps to use the stadium going forwards as a means of securing long-term, relatively low-interest debt in the same way that Arsenal did and in the same way that Tottenham did when they built their new stadiums. Obviously today, interest rates are much higher than when Arsenal and Tottenham did theirs, and Everton themselves are in a much worse financial position than Arsenal and Tottenham were at the time when they took their long-term debt. But that's the solution that needs to happen. The existing creditors have to be sensible in terms of their demands, sensible in terms of when they're going to get paid and how much they're going to get paid. And Mashiri has to allow the new investor to get a secured long-term loan based on using the stadium going forwards.
And of course, Paul, the natural question for Evertonians to ask now, moving forward, is if it's not going to be 777 buying the club, then who will it be? And of course, Everton are open to offers, as we say. That in itself is not an issue, unless, of course, Mashiri is unable to find people that can fund the club's cash shortfall or the existing creditors. Now, I don't know what information you know or what you can share with us, but in terms of whether you feel Mashiri can find the right people moving forward, do you think that's significant at this stage?
I don't think there's ever been a problem about there being alternative investors. The problem has been a contractual one, and the club and Mashiri, I think, have been very poor in articulating this. People couldn't get in front of Mashiri. People couldn't have the types of discussions that you and I are now having, or at least on the same topics, because effectively Mashiri was tied to 777. There's a form of exclusivity, and he would have incurred major costs had he gone and spoken to other people. And as we now have the situation where 777 drop out. So he's not been able to have those discussions. That doesn't mean that there aren't people out there that are interested. There's several American investment groups. There's several groups that we probably wouldn't want to have as owners. They're the type of people that buy assets when they're very distressed. and they break them up as much as they possibly can, and they look to make profits from the very low position at which they start at. I think there's another type of investor, probably American, probably somebody that's already invested in sports franchises, as they call it, in the US, may already own some European clubs. People who've got a background in sports management, possibly a background even in terms of media rights, etc., who understand the space and understand where football's going in the future. We need people with a sense of vision. We need people also who recognise the totally unexploited development potential for the area in which Bramley Moor has been built. Currently, the stadium sits in isolation, and there's very little, if any, major development plans to go around the stadium in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of hotels, conference centres, residential, all the types of developments that you might see in other places in the world where a stadium's built. And I think that all forms part of the potential of the potential of the opportunity for an investor coming into Everton at this stage. So it may well be that somebody comes in with a property development background as well. That would be the ideal candidate.
And I think I should also just acknowledge with you, Paul, as well, there was talk this week about John Textor, the co-owner of Crystal Palace, saying that he wants to buy Everton, saying that Crystal Palace is no longer an ideal fit for his multi-club portfolio because he can't acquire a majority shareholding. I think he's got a 45% share in Palace, but I believe he would have to sell those shares, and my understanding at this stage is it's very unlikely that Everton and John Textor would agree a deal together.
It is. I mean, I do understand that he'd be very keen to acquire Everton if he was able to do so. But his shareholding at Palace, whilst it's 45%, they have a sort of slightly strange arrangement at Palace whereby no single shareholder can own more than 25% of the voting shares. So he only has a 25% vote if the shareholders have to decide, on any particular issue. So trying to sell that to somebody who's coming in from the outside and isn't one of the existing shareholders at Palace, and none of the existing shareholders at Palace seem willing or want to acquire more shares. He's been trying to sell these shares for more than 12 months now, and hasn't done so yet. The very fact that he's come out publicly and said, yes, I would like to buy Everton, or I would like to be part of something that bought Everton, actually weakens his negotiating position in selling his Crystal Palace shares. I always believe that if you're a seller of anything, you should be a reluctant seller, not a seller that is already given a reason why they have to sell. So I find it difficult to believe that in any reasonable time frame, given that he's already spent 12 months trying to sell, that he would be able to sell his shares now. And you're absolutely right, the Premier League regulations say that he has to sell his Palace shares if he's going to acquire a significant or total stake in Everton Football Club.
And as you say, speculation and talk about the new owners, whoever they may be, will continue over the next few weeks and months. Just before we finish, Paul, I just want to go back to the point you made before about Everton having to offload players this summer. I know that Sean Dyche and Kevin Thelwell, the director of football, have said that Everton don't necessarily have to offload players to comply with profit and sustainability rules. But of course, speculation does continue, doesn't it, about the likes of Jared Branthwaite, linked to Manchester United now, but for a price significantly lower than the £80 million valuation that Everton have put on that particular player. We're led to believe that no players will be sold cheaply this summer in a fire sale. But in terms of what you think is going to happen in terms of players like Branthwaite, what do you expect that we will see this summer?
I think, to be honest, I think the club are making the right noises in terms of, to use the expression I used a few minutes ago, of being reluctant sellers. So, they're sort of putting their pitch out there that, we don't have to sell, and we're only really going to sell if we absolutely get the very best deal. The reality, as I see it, is somewhat different, that they have to sell. But I don't blame the club at all for putting their stance out there that they don't have to. And obviously, the market, the football industry, the agents, owners of other football clubs will probably see through what Everton is saying publicly, at least, and unfortunately. And this is ultimately down to Moshiri's misjudgments in terms of what he's done in the past, what he did in terms of choosing 777. We don't really have a very strong negotiating hand. And of course, one thing that a lot of people forget in football is that for the agents are actually very happy if they're in a situation where the selling club has to sell for a lower price than they might have to elsewhere, because the lower the price that the player sold for means the greater the amount of negotiating power they have in the player's future wages at whichever club they go to. So in every sense, it works against the selling club when you're negotiating from a position of weakness.
And we also understand, of course, as well, that Everton have open talks with Dominic Calvert-Lewin about a new contract. His current deal expires next summer, so we'll see what develops with that as well. Paul, it's been really good to talk to you. I'm really pleased to hear that you're in good health again. And, we'll continue to talk, I'm sure, over the weeks and months as the news about Everton continue. If anybody listening wants to hear more about your thoughts and your opinions, of course, don't forget the Talking the Blues podcast, where we can hear your views on there as well. But it's really good to talk to you, Paul, and hopefully we'll have further news and maybe better news for Everton as the weeks continue.
Thank you. Time short, obviously. Can I just say thank you very much to you and to your listeners for all of your support over the last 9-12 months when I've had my health problems, and when Everton have had so many problems as well. It's great to have that support, so thank you both.